I get up every morning and say, how have they tried to hate or kill us today? Jews have stood for righteousness. Jews have stood for justice. Jews have stood for hope and peace and many ideas that other nations have failed to fulfill. So they can blame the Jews for their failures.
It seems to be that people are coming out of everywhere to show their anti-Semitism out in public. They're not even embarrassed by it.
The highest educated people are the most anti-Semitic, and we see it every day. How do you feel about the idea of suppression? Because we also know that if you love freedom of speech and freedom of this and freedom of that, then you'd say that's anti-freedom.
I really wish the Jews controlled everything.
They claim we control.
Claim that we control, including the weather.
The first thing I have to think about is my survival and survival of my people. If I'm dead, I'm of no use to anybody anyhow.
We can't bury our heads in the sand, and we can't be middle of the ground either, but we're not going to lower ourselves to violence. What we need to do is we need to come together. We need to be strategic. We need to be unified, and we need to act now.
My name is Israel Ellis, and this is The Unfiltered View, a companion to the wake-up call. This is where truth breaks through the noise.
In the aftermath of the October 7th attack on Israel, Jews around the world have experienced a tidal wave of anti-Semitism unprecedented in these modern times. People protesting the right of Israel to exist and promoting hate and violence towards the Jew have hit our city streets, university campuses, and social media. There is a lack of legislation and agency to stop the momentum of hate. The unreasonable are unabated in their dissonance. When it comes to Jew haters, they will give up every last morsel of their humanity to be heard. The syllabus of hate in our education systems and on public media are giving way to the liberalization and normalization of hate. I am Israel Ellis, and today with me on The Unfiltered View, a companion to the wake-up call, is my guest, Andria Spindel, the director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, otherwise known by its acronym, the CAEF. Welcome, Andria, to The Unfiltered View.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's people like you who carry the banner and who call out the hate and call it anti-Semitism. You are truly a light for our community, and I can't thank you enough for your service and really carrying forward the words "never again." It takes people like Andria Spindel to make sure that "never again" are not just mere words.
And I have to tell you, it's become a mission, right? I get up every morning and say, how have they tried to hate or kill us today?
And that's what this episode is about. It's our second episode of The Unfiltered View, which is a companion to The Wake-Up Call, which is a book that is out there on Amazon called The Wake-Up Call, Global Jihad and the Rise of Anti-Semitism, as a book that I've published earlier this year. And in response to October 7th, the aftermath, October 8th, and the tsunami, that tidal wave of anti-Semitism that has happened globally, I'd like to be able to rationalize it, but I can't. It's become unreasonable. It has become something beyond anything that many of us can imagine. I'm not afraid to say that it's not that I'm intimidated by it, but I'm really fearful of it, not just about myself. I'm fearful of it for the future of our generations. I'm fearful of it for the world, what it's become. So let's dive right into it. Let's start off with, what is anti-Semitism? How do we define anti-Semitism? And what does it mean to be an anti-Semite?
Wow. Okay. I'll give you some thoughts about it. First of all, I have to say that our organization has endorsed the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to just read it. It's very straightforward, the one sentence. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, it's not enough to just say anti-Semitism is Jew hatred, because that's what I just read. That's what it amounts to. And it's carried out in many ways in both speech and behavior. And it ends up at times being beyond harassment and threats, but physical attacks and murder. The important components that I think, which often get refuted or disputed, are the illustrative examples of what is anti-Semitism. And I think that people need to understand that anti-Semitism is really a double standard applied to the Jewish state and the Jewish people that you wouldn't apply to any other state or people, holding Jews to a higher moral standard, holding Israel to a higher moral standard. It also includes denialism and distortion of Jewish history, and particularly around the Holocaust. Some people have tried to equate Israel's self-defense against Gaza as equivalent to the Nazi Holocaust, which is insanity on steroids. There is no comparison. Calling for the end of Israel is anti-Semitism. Nobody is calling for the end of Iran, which is the leading supporter of terrorism around the world, or the end of Nigeria, where Nigerian Islamists are killing Christians. It's worse than just a double standard. So associating really negative, what you would call stereotypical anti-Semitic tropes against the Jewish people or the Jewish state is anti-Semitic, and it should be criminalized.
So this is something I've always thought about, and we've heard about anti-Semitism being part of the DNA of people. Why do you think that people hate the Jews?
You asked, I guess even prior to that question, what is it and why is it? And the why is very difficult. There are many theories. So historically, we know that it's because Jews were of a different faith than the majority Christians or the majority Muslims. And we have to remember that's both. The Jews suffered under both religious majority governments and cultures. Then it was about calling Jews a race other than white and Aryan in Nazi Germany. And that spread across North Africa also and was adopted by Arabic countries. And interestingly enough, the Nazis befriended the Arabs, yet while they were promoting a white nationalism. Today, anti-Semitism is the fodder of the human rights organizations, which is incredible. It's an inverse reality. And what I think is an interesting concept, I just want to share one idea that's me.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It is an oxymoron. Absolutely. And then we're living in a world of inverse reality totally. But Rabbi Raphael Shor recently wrote a book and produced a film. And when asked what is the source, he said something I thought was interesting. I don't know if it's an absolute truth, but it stuck with me. And he said, Jews have represented something that it's not just that we've been othered, but it's like we're the conscience of the world. Jews have stood for righteousness. Jews have stood for justice. Jews have stood for hope and peace, and many ideas that other nations have failed to fulfill. So they can blame the Jews for their failure. So we are typically blamed for all ills and all evil, basically those very things that the others are carrying out.
So you're saying that it's psychological in the sense that it's a defense mechanism towards the guilt that nations are feeling about not being who they want to be, about the lack of the difference between their ideal selves and who they know that innately what it means to be in the human experience and how they failed, but they see the Jew as this opportunity of a scapegoat to say, hey, the Jew is of the higher moral standard, and because we have failed, therefore we're going to project on the Jewish person, and we're going to promote this hatred so that we can get over our own guilt.
You made it sound rational, but it's not rational.
Thank you.
But there is something to exactly what you just said. It is guilt, and it's not even that they want to achieve it. It's almost like they don't want to, so don't keep reminding us that we're failing, that we're bad, that we're pushing concepts that are not humane. Just get out of our face, and the Jews represent what they don't want.
So there's always been this concept of Jews, or there's this sort of called the chosen people. And do you think that there's jealousy there, that the Jews walk around as if they're the chosen people, or that we've given? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what was said. And actually, for many years, I belonged to a Jewish religious movement that countered the chosen people concept, that took away many concepts. That was one of them, and said that's not only it's got us into trouble, but it's wrong. We're not the chosen people. So I've gone full circle. I came to understand that it wasn't, there's another way to look at it. You could say Jews chose God. If you're of, I guess, more left-leaning Jewish movements, religious movements, Reform, Reconstructionists, that's the way they would put it. Others would say calling when the Jews say they're the chosen people, that's a supremacist notion, and therefore it needs to be eradicated. But I don't think it ever actually meant that, in the sense that it said the Jews were better than other people, when they said they were chosen to take on a responsibility, to be a light unto the world. That doesn't mean that they were chosen to run the world. And I think that's how it's misapprehended.
I think all of this rhetoric and all the protests that we see and the sort of the equation with anti-Zionism is sort of anti-Semitism. A lot of it is happening in our city streets. It's happening on campuses. It seems to be that people are coming out of everywhere to show their anti-Semitism out in the public. They're not even embarrassed by it. It seems that they feel that they have a license to go out there and do it. Just the other day, I heard a news report that at a store, at a Shoppers Drug Mart at Bloor and Spadina, there was a Jewish couple shopping there, and the manager came up to them and asked them to leave.
I think what's really important is something you said earlier when you gave the title of your book. What's going on is global jihad. And people don't want to say that. They don't want to know it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They don't want to be associated with it. But there are people on our streets who are protesting, who are paid to protest, who are driven by an Islamist agenda, and others are falling in. One has to ask, why are people who are totally, well, they may be educated, totally ignorant about Israel and the Jewish people?
They don't even know which
way with this. Yeah, like really crazy. And people are not willing to talk about what's driving this protest. Where is it coming from? Who's paying for it? Who benefits from it? Why is it now part of our federal election?
We're going to get to that. I'd like to get to that a little bit because actually that's a very good point. I feel that there's definitely a cover up going on. And it's like what we talked about, that story that happened downtown Shoppers Drug Mart, that not everyone knows what the full details are. And it's hard to believe like something like that can actually happen. And it's definitely important that we become objective and that we investigate things and we don't sensationalize them and jump on the bandwagon of misinformation and then end up with a story that isn't quite what it actually is. And actually, that's a big part of the problem of what's happening. But what I think is that it comes down to agency. It comes down to political powers. It comes down to the fact that there's been 10 million people added to the Canadian population in the last 10 years, a million of which has happened in the last years. 250,000, I understand, are Palestinian or Middle East descent. So we're at 5.8% of the Arab vote, of the Muslim vote. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but of the Muslim vote we're at 5.8%, which I understand is the tipping point in terms of an election. And so they're going to pander to the Muslim community, and they will do so at the expense of the Jew, because at the end of the day, their goal is to get into power and to stay in power. And so what we're seeing a lot of things that are making me as a Jew feel unwelcome in Canada, but I'm also just shocked at seeing the actual formalization into our educational syllabus of things like Nakba Day or the anti-Palestinian racism policies, which is, again, another reversal opportunity, reverse engineering the whole anti-Semitism thing. And yeah, I guess I'm pretty shocked by it. I'd like to say I'm not surprised, but I am surprised because I've grown up feeling really safe as a Jew in this country, but today I feel completely betrayed. I want to ask you a bit of just take you back to 1933. And we have grown up in this world relating anti-Semitism to what happened in Eastern Europe, to what happened in Europe, to the Holocaust. And so we see the face of anti-Semitism as these German nationalists under the Nazi Party having put together this final solution, this horrible part of history and humanity. And I think that I grew up seeing anti-Semitism in that way. I saw the conflict in the Middle East as more of a territorial conflict between the Arabs and the Jews who were establishing in Israel and whatever the story was. But I never saw that spilling over globally. What I want to ask you, Andria, is today, anti-Semitism, you said it, anti-Semitism is more within this global jihad happening, the framework of global jihad. One can almost say that it's a Islamic face to anti-Semitism today, not this right-wing nationalist European sort of German thing that we were growing up having come after the follow-up of that in our lives. But today we're seeing a different type of anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering if you could compare the two periods. Let's compare sort of the 1933 to 1945 period, where we saw anti-Semitism of more of a sort of a European nature, to now to 2025, so nearly 90 years later, and it's more of this Islamic sort of anti-Semitism. What is the main difference here? I've just said a bit of a difference.
But it isn't different. It isn't. So first of all, there's a big piece of missing information in what you say, which is to suggest that there was a difference in how Europeans and European Christians and Arab Muslims behaved. You have to remember that the Nazis were partners with Palestinian leadership, Arab leadership in what was then the Mandate for Palestine. They weren't Palestinians themselves because that didn't exist, but they were there.
But was the Mufti
was the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you like, in Palestine, and he went and spent time sitting with Hitler in Germany, and he was given the authority, the right, the support to destroy the Jews in Palestine. Not Jews that had come there. They hadn't come there yet. They were already there. They hadn't fled the Holocaust. They came later, but he was going to destroy the Jewish community there. And there was a major, as you probably know, a massacre in 1929. So that's certainly before 33. But even before that, and I have been corrected on this, and I really want to give Dr. Andrew Bostom a shout out. He has talked about the fact that Jews were never equal in any Arab country. And in the 10th century, there were massacres. In the 11th century, there were pogroms. This is not new. In 1941, there was the Harud in Iraq. So really, where were the Jews safe? They were maybe better off historically under Muslim regimes than in Christian, but they were not equal. And they were not always well treated, and there was often persecutions and various attacks. So that's history, has to be understood.
And within that, hold on, but Andrea, within that
I think that we need to look at, but let me just go on, because I don't think people understand that the spread of ism, I'll say, has been well thought out. This is a planned approach, and it was described very well by a woman who publishes under the name Bat Yor. She wrote a book called Eurabia decades ago, when she talked about the fact that a population migration would go on into Europe and beyond and change the very face, the very culture of those nations, and it's happening today. So you talked about the number of Gazans or Palestinians that have come to Canada. Think all of North Africa. From 1947 to 67, every Arab country expelled its Jews, right? So this is not something new. It may be it's building from and copying and repeating what the Nazis said. And in the West, it hasn't yet been as lethal.
So you talk about Islam-isms. Is there a difference between Islam-isms and jihadism?
I don't think so. And I think that we're all a little trepid about using the description of Islam or Islamic or Islamism. I've been really cautioned. Talk about Islamism, because certainly not all people of the Islamic faith want to kill us. That is true. But the book of Islam, the Quran, is very hostile to the Jews. Certainly there was a period of time in the Muhammad, the Prophet's life, where he was out to kill Jews.
You and I have talked about this before, and I've come on your sort of webinar and we've talked about it, and some people have agreed with me and some people have really not been happy with me. The way I look at it is, when I talk about these things, is I face the reality that there are 2 billion Muslims in this world, plus in excess of. And I think about the fact that, hey, I don't think every one of them want to kill Jews. Every one of them are anti-Semitic. But if we go ahead and we create this narrative that is anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim, I think we're going to alienate those Muslims that are sympathetic to the Jewish cause. And so I'm very careful not to join that narrative. I like to be able to call it jihadism. And jihadism to me is a radicalized form of Islam. I think it's a manipulation of the Quran, and it is the lovers of death. It is people who rationalize what they're doing with no other outcome than to create destruction and chaos and anarchy by having this sort of vision of this global caliphate, and they'll do it by any means. There are words that are used, terminology that is used thousands of years ago that today is subject to an interpretation of the social times at the times in which those words were being used. And I don't think that we can take these things literally. At the end of the day, I think there is an innate moral consciousness, okay? There is an innate moral consciousness regarding the killing of somebody, regarding this idea of taking a life. And I don't think anyone's going to disagree. That is wrong. And it doesn't matter of what religion. And I don't think any reasonable religious Muslim person who fears God is going to say it's okay to kill somebody. It's okay to kill a Jew. And I feel that this is where people get distracted by the sensationalism, just like that story that we were talking about that happened at Shoppers Drug Mart, where you need to go ahead and investigate it. I think this needs to be investigated. So I feel, and I know that this is not taken kindly by many, but I just want to say that, yes, that the situation that we're in, the anti-Semitism, but I feel that's got to come from a more radicalized version of an interpretation of the religious context of the Quran that is taken out of context and is being used for the purpose of individuals who really, at the end of the day, seek power and seek domination in this idea of this global caliphate.
Okay, so two things.
A lot there.
I think I'd almost reverse what you said. You've talked about it being an interpretation and a radicalization, and I'd say the opposite. I would say the literal words of the Quran and the Hadith are problematic, and the people who are trying to give an interpretation that is different are really the moderates and the reformers. So the majority of people, as you said, are not out to kill, but they're also not following the literal word of their holy books. Okay, so the literalists are really going back in time and taking the word and following what Muhammad himself did and said. If Muhammad said, Khyber killed the Jews or whatever, I don't know the exact wording, then this is now being repeated. It's not an interpretation, it's literal. It's exactly what happened then, and it's being repeated now. So some people are following that. And where does it come from? It comes from today's Muslim scholars. I am told, and again, I don't know, that Al-Azhar University in Cairo is the seat of all of where, if you like, the authority, the highest authority in Islam, and this is what they teach. And this is then they teach, and they have all their preachers go out in the world and repeat it. The same is true with the leadership in Iran. They have an interpretation and they repeat it and they teach it. If you look at the religious leaders guiding the Palestinian Authority, they're horrific in their treatment of what they believe to be the truth about the Jews in Israel, etc. So what we really need to find is those, if you like, modernized, westernized people of the Muslim faith who do agree with what you just said, that it isn't all about killing, that there is recognition of humanity. But think of this. The UAE has signed an agreement, a peace accord with Israel. The Abraham Accords are very important. But a recent study showed that the government has signed with Israel. 80% of the people in the UAE are anti-Semitic. And that's true across all the Arab countries. Recent study that was published and then withdrawn. I think the ADL put it up and then took it down or something. But really, anti-Semitism is at very high levels across the world, in every country. And among the Arab countries, it's very high, notwithstanding the Arab Accords, the peace agreement. Jordan and Egypt have peace agreements, but they are not, the people there are not wholly loving of Israel and accepting Israel's existence.
It's not because they've turned around and said, we love Jews. We love you, Jew. That's not happening. So, what is the answer, Andrea? We've got this sort of age old situation where we have anti Semitism that is popping up, and every so often it becomes this tidal wave, like it's become as of 8th, where there's an excuse where people just go crazy. They just feel this license to unleash themselves and
Right.
to remove whatever social protocol, whatever social barriers are there in front of them.
And so we need to acknowledge, because we've spent a lot of time looking at the Islamic side or Islamism, but the left, talk about the left.
Oh, yeah.
Muslim.
I'm watching the drama unfold in one of the oldest and greatest university institutions of education that has become to say that I went to Harvard it's a badge of honor. If you went to Harvard Medical School or went to Harvard Law School, that's all you got to say to get the big dollars out there. Everyone's striving to go to Harvard. And yet here is this institution, and everywhere within the institution is endemic is the idea of anti-Semitism, no matter of the subject matter that's coming up. And so now we get a president in power who says this has just got to stop. And for one thing, that, it's like a no nonsense, no bullshit sort of situation over here with Trump. And yet, I don't know, was it $2 billion? It was a tremendous amount of money. Was it $4 billion? I forget the number, that whether or not they'll go ahead with it and withhold that funding.
Withholding the money unless they met his terms.
Right. And it's unbelievable that an institution such as Harvard, that has that kind of prestige over hundreds of years within the American system, that is world renowned and respected, has gotten to the point where they're going to die on that hill. They're going to fall on that sword, because they're saying that we will not allow government to come in and intervene in our educational system and tell us what we can or cannot teach. But they have done that. They've allowed other influences over the last 25 years to come in and manipulate and change their entire educational syllabus to turn one of the most respected, advanced institutions of the educational example of America into nothing but a campus of anti-Semitism.
So we have to look at the roots of that. So there's another really important piece of history. Who were the leaders of the Nazi regime? University professors, lawyers and judges, the medical professions. Who were the people who lost their jobs first? Probably university professors. We're very naive if we think the most educated will be in our court. It's the exact opposite. Study done by AMCHA, which is an organization in the US, showed that the highest educated people are the most anti-Semitic, and we see it every day. We're seeing it among our politicians, in the media, in academia. And so where does it come from? You said 25 years longer ago, my generation. I was at university in the 60s, and I think that when all of this cultural relativism was introduced, ultimately to become critical race theory, we began this slippery slope down this road of dividing people by categories that make no sense. And we're dominated by that. You talked about how the school system has been taken over. The universities have been taken over. Our entire cultural establishment has been taken over by nonsense called critical race theory, which is carried out through diversity, equity, and inclusion training, which gives preference to some groups based on immutable characteristics and pushes others out and takes away all their opportunities. And the Jews are at the top of the list. White, privileged, blah, 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 nonsense. So, like, the crazy part in my mind is, how does the extreme Islamo-fascist thinking blend with the extreme alt-leftist thinking, both being anti-Semitic, and if we were not in place, they'd kill each other?
Well, the thing is, when you talk about educated, that the most educated people are at the top of the whole anti-Semitic bandwagon, is that anyone who studied history sees the cycle of what happens to society that falls into that and gives into that. And what happens to those societies? They're just destroyed and they fall apart. And so it seems to be so self-sabotaging that we are at this height, if you will. And you talk about the liberal left. I want to talk about that for a second, because the fact is, is that 2025 is probably unprecedented consumer wealth, and the average person lives a certain luxury life, if you will, nothing compared to hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago even, where you've got diseases rampant or people don't even have bathrooms in their houses and things. So I'm not trying to like sound privileged over here and entitled, but the fact is that the most average of people out there on welfare or healthcare or benefits, things like that. I'm not saying it's a perfect world, and I'm not saying that people aren't suffering, but I would say that humanity is doing a lot better than ever before with technology, with social programs, with human consciousness, with the idea of diversification and allowing that diversification within society of acceptance. And yet we're at the height of this. We're at the height of this. And it's like this self-destructive mechanism. And you talk about the liberal left and you talk about these educated people. So I've got my own theories about it. And one of it, I really think everything does come down to money. And I think the liberal left has been bankrupt for years. Perhaps it was short-sighted on the part of our governments not to see that and to refuse to fund it and to therefore have influence. But ultimately, who funds? He or she who funds the educational system is going to have a say in the educational system. And
that's what's happened. We have had.
Exactly.
The left has provided the resources, provided the leadership, and fostered this. It's not coming. The government wasn't.
We talk about the left as some sort of obscure, not even identified body of people. But the fact is that somehow, like the liberal movement that started out as an ideological response to civil unrest or civil imposement by the more conservative governments, and the liberal movement became enriched by the idea that the momentum of people who are fighting against the man. But what happened is that movement grew, and then it became bankrupt. And
I know in Israel, again, we misread history and we buy the mythology that's created. Who freed the slaves? It was not the Democrats, it was the Republicans. And that's a fact. Okay, who brought in the civil rights legislation? It was the Republicans and not the Democrats. Somehow our mythology has been that the Democrats represent liberalism. In fact, today, the illiberal liberals are the problem. And the conservatives, at least in Canada, are the classical liberals. I think these extremes have always existed. There's a middle road somewhere, center right, center left. I don't know. I don't have political theoretical background, but there is something about the extremes. And the mythology is that the Democrats always did the best because they created social welfare programs, which may be true, but examine the outcomes of those social welfare programs. I'm a social worker by training. Many of those programs took away agency and destroyed families. It's a terrible thing to say, but people were given, as you said, all of the social welfare benefits, and taken away was their responsibility. We haven't benefited from the theories that we have promoted.
I think it's not that we're getting off topic, but I'm hearing what you're saying. And what you're saying is that on a society level, we've instituted all these different programs and that they've been influenced by the left side of the spectrum, political spectrum. But like anything else, they've been used. They've been used to divide and conquer and to create these power vacuums. And I think that one has to look at these things really from a macro level in order to see how that all happened. But at the end of the day, this is my point. My point is that there was a vacuum. There was a sort of and the funding came in from outside. Talk about foreign interference. There seems to be a lot of airtime given to foreign influence. This is the foreign influence that started to happen. It happened when universities were starving from cash, when these educational systems, their budgets were growing and they were starving from cash, and they started to take in all this private money, and there was like a blind eye to where that money was coming from. But the money was coming from Qatar. It was coming from the very nations that we made extraordinarily wealthy by consuming the oil that they produce that we have then taken that oil, and it's like we've made these people, we've made these countries, they were nothing. They were nothing 100 years ago. Over 100 years ago, Saudi Arabia, all of the Middle East, of these pan-Arabic countries were nothing compared to what they are today. But now they have extraordinary wealth. They've taken that extraordinary wealth and they've poured it into our public institutions that were bankrupt. We have, I say the royal we, but the government at the time, whether it be liberal or conservative or whoever it was, turned a blind eye to it. And universities stated emphatically that it wouldn't influence their educational syllabus. We know what happened there. So ultimately, money is going to drive that influence. And it's now very deeply ingrained in the process. But here we are today. And we're in this very deeply ingrained anti-Semitic culture that has become part of our society, that is destroying our society. That is,
you have to call it a holy war. It's never been about land. And when you talk about it being money, I would say money is just one of the tools and not the only tool. But look at the grand plan. And if spreading Islamic supremacy is the plan, then there's many ways to do it. One is to put money into your cultural and educational institutions. Another is to get elected to office and become part of the political mainstream, which is happening.
That is happening.
Another is to own the media. Al Jazeera has been very effective. Nobody wanted to ban it, but I can remember 20 years ago when it was a problem and there was a debate. So I think we just don't want to admit this many-fronted war. And why is the left in bed with them? I'll say the opposite. The left has developed this anti-colonial theory. Who were the greatest colonial empires of the world? They were the Arabic Muslim colonial empires, and there's still 5 Muslim countries, Arab countries, that have black slaves. Okay? The world doesn't want to hear about that. They don't want to talk about the fact that jihadists are killing Christians in the Congo and in Nigeria. How is that related to the left? They've adopted the anti-colonial framework. The jihadists are now using the anti-colonial framework and in bed with the kids who are anti-colonial. They're the biggest colonizers.
So Andrea, people have told to me you can defend yourself, but you can't kill an ideology. Last week when I was interviewing some IDF soldiers and we were talking about what is the solution, I hate to use the word solution, but what is the answer to what's going on in Gaza? Is it the evisceration of Hamas? And one of the young men said to us, hey, you can get rid of Hamas completely, but you cannot kill an ideology. We're in that same situation right now with anti-Semitism. What do you think is if I were to ask you to go 10 years forward, look back in history so that we're at a point where people are saying we should have, could have, or would have, what would that should have, could have, or would have be today if you can control that today? What is the answer today? What do we need to do immediately?
Well, the soldier who said you can't kill it is right. But first of all, the source of it is the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is just the Palestinian branch. And we have the Muslim Brotherhood here in Canada, and it's not even listed as a terrorist organization, even though there's dozens of organizations that are listed that are part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I hate to say it, but I think we have to suppress some of it, because you're right. You can't eradicate it and have it gone forever. You have to put a stop to it. Just like Nazism is banned.
We're not going to get rid of anti-Semitism. Hold on, Andrea, we're not going to get rid of anti-Semitism. That's what you're saying.
You're going to have to suppress it, is what I'm saying.
Okay, so the best thing we can do is suppress it. But if we don't, but what does that mean to suppress it? It means that we got to be able to impose will on somebody. We have to be able to enforce something. We have to be able to go into the educational structures, and we have to say what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. Right. And I say this stuff and people go crazy on me. Yet everywhere in London, when I go anywhere if you go to visit London in the UK, and I go there fairly often, there are cameras everywhere. There's not one place in London you can go without a camera watching you. It is one of the cities, the greatest proliferation of CCTV in the world is probably in the London, UK. And that's just gone beyond that into other cities. I'm sure New York is. I would say that's a huge invasion of my privacy, that I can't be picking my nose somewhere and some camera's not going to pick it up. Okay. But I agree with you. So this is really interesting. In order that we have to understand, number one, that just like an ideology, let me ask you, is anti-Semitism an ideology?
It is the nub of it. If you look at, I'm not the best person to answer it, but if you look at the Hamas Charter and the Palestinian Authority Charter, their sole goal is to eradicate the Jews. If that isn't an anti-Semitic ideology, I don't know what is.
Okay,
but they don't have any other goal.
And what's interesting, we talk about the oxymoron, the ultimate oxymoron or dissonance out there, and you talk about the greatest perpetrators of colonialism and of even slavery is happening today within sort of Arab nations, which isn't being talked about, right? And then you've got they are supporting a left that has become this anti-colonial movement, right? And yet these humanists out there are going to go ahead and support the charter. They don't even say anything about the charter of a Hamas or Palestinian. So it's a mess, right? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to agree, number one, that anti-Semitism could be or is in some respects an ideology. And number two, you cannot kill an ideology. And therefore, number three, the only way to suppress it, and that is becoming harder and harder as we are getting a larger voting bloc of Muslims,
right,
potentially radicalized Muslims,
right,
who are not going to go against their sort of family, but they're going to vote for their family. And so what's happening in Europe, some people say it's 20 years away, others say it's 10, some people say it's 30 years away. But the problem is that if you're going to have a democracy, and we're going to support a democracy, and it takes a majority of voters or a majority within a democratic institution, within a house, to put legislation forward that's going to suppress what some consider inalienable rights of people to express themselves, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of education. If you're going to have to go ahead and suppress that, you're going to need the agency to do that. You're going to need legislation. That means that you're going to need a considerable amount of clout within the parliament of a democratic institution in order to make that happen.
And it isn't happening.
Are we screwed?
The more I think about it, the worse I feel. Hitler was elected, correct?
Yes.
So democracy is messy. And bad things come out of that too. Look at some people believe Abbas was elected, Hamas was elected. They had some kind of an election and they elected terrorists.
So people see Trump as somewhat moving away from democracy, that Trump is the Antichrist.
Well, he said he's going to do what he was elected to do.
And he was elected, and yet he's getting things done. He's going and he's telling Harvard, I'm taking away your funding. If anyone who's anti-Semitic is considered a threat to our nation. I can't believe it. And I'm just going to say this too. I can't believe today we're actually negotiating once again with Iran.
I think it's a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
I'm hoping they're going to decide that it isn't going to happen and they'll quit. So I read it. Iran has said there's no way they're going to negotiate, that they won't have the nuclear weapons. By the way, we'll only negotiate if you take away all the things.
It's always constant insanity. But the point is like this.
So how do you feel about the idea of suppression? Because we also know that if you love freedom of speech and freedom of this and freedom of that, then you'd say that's anti-freedom.
I really wish the Jews controlled everything.
They claim we control.
That we control, including the weather. No. The thing is that, I agree with you. It's really interesting that we've come to this place of, in order for us not to be overridden by anti-Semitism, in order for us to be protected. And it's not just about Jews, is it?
No.
It starts with the Jews, and then it goes to other groups. Eventually, I went to where my wife's grandfather came from because I wanted to see what it looked like. Pre-war, Lodge was a thriving community. It was an example. It was a wonderful metropolis. If you go there today, it is a gray hell. It is just finished. You see what Lodge has become today, and it's a skeleton of what it could have been prior to the Holocaust. But that's just one example of societies that have become have destroyed themselves, have eaten themselves out from the inside, and it always starts with anti-Semitism. So it's not about the Jews. That this isn't self-serving about a small part of the world.
Israel, look what's happening to the Hindus. Okay, we don't have to just say it happens to other people. Today, Islamism is attacking Hindus in Canada, in India. There have been massacres in Bangladesh. The papers are barely reporting it, if at all. And yet I'm working with the Hindu communities here, a couple of leaders in various organizations, and they stand with us and they stand with Israel because our enemy is the same enemy.
They see it. They see it. It's not just about the Jews. It's about the Hindus. It's about the Persians. It's
Christians.
Christians. Everyone sees it. And yet we are starting to lose the battle for the ability to control the very institutions that are democratically elected so that we can have people stand up with reason to, at the very least, if not reverse, if not eradicate, is at least to suppress the ideas, to suppress the insurgency of what's happening. And it's happening in an unbridled way, in a licensed way almost, because they are celebrating in the streets like madmen, knowing that they can't be stopped, feeling that way. I talk about it in my book, The Wake Up Call, but my jaw dropped to the ground when there was a protest in the Eaton Center, and this protester went up to a police officer and said, "I'm going to take you 6 feet under, man."
I'll put you 6 feet deep. I'll put you 6 feet deep.
This is downtown Toronto, a protester, a guy with a face mask, intimidating.
Nobody was arrested at that.
No one was arrested. And then all of the arrests that were made, and this is according to the chief of police office, I spoke to them, 450 arrests were made last year, 0 convictions. Why? Because there isn't the legislation, there isn't anything in place to carry forward a conviction. There isn't a definition of hate that stops somebody from threatening a police officer, from somebody, yet a Jewish person can do a small little protest and be arrested for it.
That as well, again, I'm going to take exception. I think there is legislation, and you have to ask why it isn't being enforced. I actually believe that for some reason, the police are standing idly by, or they arrest somebody and in court, they get off with a light sentence or no conviction.
It comes down to agency. It comes down to agency of governments to protect other people, and it's not about the Jews.
Here's the one question I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, because I think you were really onto it. You said you felt betrayed at the very beginning. So who's betraying us? There are 330 candidates in this federal election from every party but the Conservative Party who have signed something called Vote Palestine, a platform in our election that has nothing to do with Canadian well-being or Canadian values, and they're going to pass, and they want legislation to ban Israel in umpteen different ways and punish Israel in 70 other ways and recognize a Palestinian state. Like, what the hell is all that about? Who's betraying us?
I think that we're betraying ourselves. I think society is betraying ourselves. I think that it's like we're biting our nose to spite our face. This is on a social level. But when I talk about betrayal, I'm talking about how I feel myself personally as someone that naively grew up in this country feeling protected and feeling like I lived in the greatest possible place on earth, and felt so fortunate, and felt that the idea of another Holocaust, or the idea of anyone taking over and going out there and having the wholesale killing of Jews or hatred of Jews, that idea was so far-fetched I couldn't believe it. I've betrayed myself in the disillusioned safety that I felt growing up. And I'm angry now because I feel completely betrayed by the very institutions, the very people that I held in such high regard, who I thought under the social contract to protect us. I always thought that reason would prevail over unreasonableness, that rationale would prevail over irrationality, that the lover of life would always prevail over the lover of death. And I feel betrayed because all of those things after October 7th and in the aftermath of October 8th moving forward, all out the window. Everything I believed in is no longer there. And it's a difficult reality. It prompted me to write a book. It prompted me to go on this journey that I'm on right now, because we need to all bring awareness. I want to take a little bit of a shift over here. And you talked about anti-Zionism anti-Israel equating with anti-Semitism. And I just want to define this for a moment because I struggle with the language of it myself. And I seem to have to say that there are anti-Israel protests, but I need to add the word anti-Semitism in there as well. And some people will say, you're a wonderful person. I really like you. I really want to do business with you. And you're welcome to live here. The only problem is you're Jewish. And so is that the case? Is it that if you stand against Israel, are you anti-Semitic?
Yes.
Okay,
I
unequivocally.
totally believe it, and I'll tell you why. Because the people who are anti-Zionist, except for those who are ignorant and have no idea what they're standing for, and there seems to be, from a number of surveys, they've seen a lot of people go out to protest to be with their friends. But basically, those people don't believe that Israel has the right to exist. Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself. Israel doesn't have the right to be a Jewish state. The Jews don't have a right to have a state. And by the way, you've stolen somebody else's land. So with all of that in mind, yes, that's anti-Semitism. It's a degradation of Jewish history. It's denial of the realities of Israel. It's complete fraud, suggesting that Israel isn't multi-faith and isn't a country based on the rule of law. It completely ignores all facts and reason. It isn't true that you can't criticize Israel for various things, but I would say, why do we have to criticize Israel, period? Why do people have to spend so much time finding a reason to criticize Israel or its government or its policies and say, I can criticize all these things, but I still support Israel? Why? If you want to make a difference in Israel, go live there and vote there. Just stop it. And I hold Jews responsible for a lot of this.
You know what? When I've asked my son why he joined the IDF and became a lone soldier, which, by the way, he's now on a list, which is another thing that I cannot believe. I cannot understand. I'm so naive. I'm so disillusioned in my own betrayal that I can't believe that a government that in today's world that they will allow this website to exist that targets lone soldiers. And the worst of it is, Andrea, of that website, the insidiousness of that website and that person, this David Marachi, whatever, is that two of those boys on that website have died. And their parents, one in Vancouver and one in Montreal, their parents, to see a site, to see them disrespect and dishonor their child. Is there no honor anymore amongst any of these people? Are they that of morality of any
kind? They are demonic.
They are indecency. They are indecent people. But when I asked my son, and when he's been interviewed about why did he join the army, he says, I stood up in synagogue and we would make a mishaberach, we make a prayer for Israel. And I'd look around and I'd say, oh, that's nice. Is that what you're going to do? You're going to pray? No, he went out and he said, I'm going to do something.
Wow.
But here's what I think, that Israel, as long as Israel exists, and this is the major difference between now and since before we had Israel, since 1948. Okay, so we're going back nearly 2,000 years to a time where Israel was a sovereign nation and indigenous to the land, may I add, to all those who like to use the word colonization and in their ignorance. But the fact is, and we all say it, that as long as Israel stands, the Jews have somewhere to go. And no matter what happens in Canada, in America, in Europe, Jews can always go to Israel. And as long as we have Israel, we have an opportunity to defend ourselves, and we have a place to go to. So when someone is anti-Israel, or someone is trying to undermine Israel as a sovereign or does not recognize Israel, I do agree that they're anti-Semites, because ultimately everybody knows this too. It's not just a secret here. The idea is that people know that Israel stands to protect Jews everywhere. It's not like Jews, although Jews everywhere do not necessarily protect Israel, which is another problem. Okay, we're getting to the end here, so I want to get some other really important, I know you've got some questions, but I want to put something out there to you. We talked about betrayal, and I told you how I feel, but how should anti-Semitism make me feel as a Jew? Should I be scared? Should I be running? Should I be angry? What is my response? What should my response be to anti-Semitism?
I don't know if there's a should, but I, like you, find it frightening, alarming. I am alarmed every day by what I'm reading in all the new ways, like the introduction of anti-Palestinian racism, which is nothing more than racist anti-Semitism itself. I find it very alarming, very shocking, and I do think there's a tipping point, and I very much worry, when will we be at the tipping point before we can't reverse it? And it will go, and we will have to, I don't know, leave the country? Do people? I keep saying that's never going to happen, but I don't know if that's true. What did Jews
thinking about it? Have you thought about leaving Canada?
I have, but only fleetingly, partly because of my age, and I have 3 adult children here. I did spend time in Israel on a kibbutz for 4 months when I was young, did an ulpan, and I actually always thought I would go there, but then I had elderly parents, so then I didn't go. So I can't see it for me.
I think we may all be having a different conversation next week if liberals come in. I have been preparing myself to have the flexibility to be able to pick up and go. And I can't believe I'm thinking this way.
I know people that really do think they will go, and people are saying, make sure your passport is up to date. But it is alarming. And the question is, how are we going to turn it around? That's what you said. So we have not yet convinced all of the Jews and the non-Jews that are allies that this is that serious. And I've been accused of fear-mongering. You probably have, when you say this is how bad it is and how it could get worse. And people don't want to hear that. And I imagine that's what happened in Germany. I don't know. All of the parties, political parties in Canada are saying that they're against anti-Semitism. They've all made statements about it. I read a document last night that compared the platforms of 4 parties, and they all mouthed the words, so to speak. But what I'm not seeing is action. And I don't know if we'll get the action from a liberal government to literally begin to push back and confront the anti-Semitism. I think we will from a conservative government. So here's the question that a lot of Jews have to ask, and non-Jews, really. Where do you put the fight against anti-Semitism and the defense of Israel on your priority list? I had a conversation last week at the synagogue with people who are saying, that's not the only thing. You have to think about the affordability issue and healthcare and housing and all the tax proposals. And I said, no, I don't. The first thing I have to think about is my survival and the survival of my people. If I'm dead, I'm of no use to anybody anyhow. So I'm going to fight for the Jews. And when the Jews are safe and there's justice for Jews, there'll be justice for everybody. If there's no justice for Jews, there's no justice for anybody.
I think that it is the Jews that have coined the very terms that are being used against us. Jews have coined the term genocide. Jews have created terminology in response to the Holocaust of what's happened out there, and human rights, the Human Rights Convention, the idea of the definition of a refugee was, I believe,
the International Criminal Court was the idea of a Jew.
And yet all of these things are now, the people who have adopted these things for humanistic purposes are now going against the Jewish people. I think that ultimately, I think about, when I think about the Holocaust, I think about my wife's grandparents, because I'm 3rd generation Canadian, but I think about them, and I used to fantasize as a kid, and I used to think, like, when would I have left? How long would didn't they see the writing on the wall? And you talked about it. When is the right time to leave? What is the tipping point where someone has to say, I'm packing up? Now, 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, actually, I don't know if it was 2/3, but in Germany, that did leave. A lot of people who could afford went to America. There was this massive immigration leading up, going to America. A lot of people went to then Palestine, and what was characterized that way by the British colonizers. And a lot of people did leave, but there's a lot of people left behind. A lot of people didn't think it would be that bad. Some said that, I went through World War I, and the Germans they're not going to touch us. This isn't going to happen. And it's hard. It is terrible to have to think that way and to wonder. every so often we hear stories. Oh, Austin, Texas is really good for Jews. Maybe we should look into Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
Or Boca Raton, Miami's, or Florida. Let's move to Florida because that's where it's good for the Jews. And I just shake my head and I'm like, that's crazy. Is it really coming to that? Is it really coming to that we need to have an exit strategy, that we need to find out where the door is that we could leave and how quickly we can go? Do we have to start sewing diamonds into the lapels of our suit jackets? Is that how bad it's getting?
Look what's happening in France and Germany. Look at the Western Europe is already turning. Eastern Europe is an option. There are fewer pogroms and protests are not even allowed in many Eastern European countries, right? Hungary, although most of us don't feel good about necessarily, but the government, it's a very pro-Israel government. I was recently in the Republic of Georgia. There's no anti-Semitism there. Their biggest fear is Russia will invade and take over, but it's not an anti-Semitic country. There are places, there are countries. The question is, are we going to have to go?
So once again, we're the wandering Jews.
Yeah, I just don't know how bad it can get. And it's frightening. I really feel that we're not looking at a promising future if the people that are going to come into government are not speaking up now and promising to take action. And we're not seeing that action. They do think they're against anti-Semitism, but they refuse to identify what is the source of it. And it is their own leftist policies, and they're bending the knee to Islamism. They're contributing to it.
Do you think, Andrea, that there is a sense of entitlement amongst Jewish people, that they feel that this should not be happening to them? Do you think that we've become, in a sense, as if we're entitled to live without people who are trying to hate us or going against Israel? That we got to wake up to this. We got to wake up. It's like a slap in the face. We got to wake up and we got to realize, hey, stop being so entitled.
Would you call it entitlement? That's interesting. Every other group talks about equal rights, justice for all. Why would we not expect that we would have the same level of justice?
I think everyone, by the way, should be
another problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So we have in Canada, federally and provincially, anti-racism strategies. And the federal government has an anti-racism program, and they will fund all kinds of anti-racist activities. And I've studied it, their document. There is one line in the anti-racist document that also says and anti-Semitism. But when you look at the criterion for the funding, and I'm not talking about all the security money that's going to synagogues to put up walls and barriers and higher security. I hate the idea that we're having to barricade ourselves into our synagogues. I hate that. Churches are not doing that. That's not where I want the money to go. I want it to go to stopping anti-Semitism at the root, stop the teaching.
In the educational.
But the programs are for vulnerable communities that don't feel they have equal participation. The Jews have lots of participation. For vulnerable people who are undereducated and need greater access to education, the Jews are not uneducated, don't have a problem accessing education. And the third criteria has to do with incomes. And the Jews are not, in the majority of Jewish communities, suffering poverty. So the anti-racism strategy doesn't really apply to the Jews if those are the criterion. However, the community experiencing the most prejudice and racism is the Jewish community, and we're not covered by these policies.
Back to community for a second, and we're gonna start to wrap up over here. But let me ask you an honest question about community. We have tremendous institutions that have been created post-1948, if you will, that have welcomed Jews in, have helped Jews settle. I got to think that the United Jewish, the UJA, is possibly one of the strongest community organizations, at least here in Toronto, in Canada, that raises very significant amounts of money, that has a tremendous reach globally, not just in Toronto, and has a lot of social programs, does tremendous work. I've been thinking about something lately, and when I see all of everything going on with the rise of anti-Semitism, have they failed us?
First of all, the UGA is like the United Way, a fundraising organization that then turns around and spends the money on social welfare and education and health programs. So I don't hold them responsible for dealing with this. That's not their role. As someone who came out of the voluntary sector, you asked what I did. So for 38 years, I ran one of the largest charitable organizations for disabled people in Canada. And so I understand completely what the charity world looks like. They fund, I imagine, maybe over 100 Jewish organizations. Maybe it's a lesser number, but it's everything from daycare to clubs to schools to the Bernard Battelle Center for Seniors. That's what UGA does. The advocacy arm that they fund is CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. So the question is, what has our advocacy arm done? What is it doing? It's not UGA, they're the funding body. And I don't know enough about who's on the board. I know that they've gone just recently through a staffing change, but I think most of us feel that CJA was working always from a diplomatic perspective behind the scenes. That's how they positioned it. And they worked with whichever government, as you have to when you're a charity. You can't be partisan. So they worked with and supported and tried to educate the various governments. Were they effective? Maybe on some level, maybe at times, but certainly not with the liberal regime that's been here for the last 9-10 years.
We've seen the emergence of a lot of satellite and
grassroots groups, because CJA has not mobilized people. They did not educate us to understand what was happening. They did not sound the alarm when it should have been sounded. They did not press home the idea that we needed to really express Zionism. And I think that's a real gap. And so have a plethora of grassroots groups.
I think ingrained within our people and like our history and growing up is schweig still.
Yeah.
Right? Be quiet. Be quiet. Don't be a dandelion. You'll get your head chopped off. This too will pass. Do you think that attitude is outdated now?
Yes, and I think it's across North America, maybe Europe too, but I work with a lot of organizations now, both in the US and Canada, and I think many are feeling that somehow we haven't had the leadership we've needed. We haven't had people prepared to take up the cudgel and fight. And it's because we haven't believed it was bad enough. We haven't really understood how bad it could be or how bad it was 10 years ago. A few did. The woman who founded our organization, Shirley Ann Haber, said in 2004, we have to fight anti-Semitism.
So the reason for this podcast is to bring awareness. And maybe through that awareness, there are people out there that are watching this that will become more educated or receive greater ideas about what they can do. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to every person out there who must act. We'd like to think that being reasonable people, that we could reason with the unreasonable people. And I would like to think that the way to deal with unreasonable people is to get to a point where you point out their unreasonableness to the point that they accept that. And as reasonable people, they recognize their unreasonableness, and they come over to be reasonable people. Except in radicalized environments and worlds, that does not happen because there is this dissonance that regardless of what you tell me, I still hate the Jews. And so it doesn't matter. I'd like to think it matters. I'd like to think we can educate people to be better, to make themselves better, to become better people, to strive to be better people. And you brought up some amazing ideas behind that. And the idea is that we've got to find ways of suppressing it. We've got to act and we've got to fight back.
Talk to the mushy middle, right? Don't just talk. You won't change the mind of the haters, but what about all the people who haven't made up their mind yet?
We can't bury our heads in the sand, and we can't be middle of the ground either, but we're not going to lower ourselves to violence. What we need to do is we need to come together. We need to be strategic. We need to be unified, and we need to act now. What Andria Spindel is doing for the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is acting. What organizations like Tough Seek is doing, a friend Amir Epstein out there, he's doing some tremendous work. And there are others that I have met in my own actions who I have been impressed with, and not just people who are in organizations, but individuals who have band together to try their best to fight this. And so what I would urge you all and anyone who's listening here today is to reach out to any organization to see what you can do, to write to your member of parliament, to attend these protests, to let the world know if you're dissatisfied, your politicians, you're of the dissatisfaction, to get out there and to try to do something, because we have to believe at the end of the day that people have to be reasonable. We have to appeal to their reasonableness, and we have to try to best secure ourselves in the world to come. We do not want to look back 10 years from now and say the words we should have, we would have, or we could have. It's today. It's now. Andria, thank you very much. I very appreciate you coming on board here today. Any last question or any last comments here for the show?
Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation and for pushing people to action. Thank you.
That's what it's about. Okay. Thank you. Another episode of The Unfiltered View. I hope that this was informative. We've got a book opening on May 29th at Indigo that is launching the Wake Up Call. I hope you'll go to their website at indigo.ca or israelellis.com. And please press and share at the bottom of your screen. And if you've got comments, we want to hear your comments. They don't necessarily have to agree with us, but we'd like to carry forward with the conversation. That's what it's all about, and that's what the Unfiltered View is meant for.
My name is Israel Ellis, and this is The Unfiltered View, a companion to the Wake Up Call. This is where truth breaks through the noise.